Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air for the 13th week of 2015. Our program is presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. Aware is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carlos DeBruin. Aware was established 13 years ago after the attacks of 9/11-2001 by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use those crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East. Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia, and control of them gives the U.S. an advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. Now, after 13 years of war, President Obama, who was elected to end George Bush's wars, is waging war in 8 countries: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, and even the Philippines, which we'll hear some more about this evening. Many Americans are unaware that the president is conducting the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, a secret series of murders by drone whereby he's already killed thousands of people, including hundreds of children. Most Americans are unaware that President Obama is bombing ISIS in Iraq and Syria in violation of the United Nations Charter, which forbids, quote, the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state without the authorization of the UN Security Council. And most Americans are also unaware that the Obama administration is recklessly provoking war with Russia in Ukraine, where a U.S. proxy government has already killed thousands, to eviscerate the Russian economy and help the American 1% profit from disorder in Eurasia. Also, most Americans don't know that U.S. Special Forces, death squads like American Sniper, are active in more than 100 countries around the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. Americans don't know, but the rest of the world does, and we're hated for it. Champaign-Urbana Aware recommends that you contact the President and our representatives in Congress and tell them to stop killing people around the world and to bring all U.S. troops home. The Aware webpage and Facebook page have email addresses and phone numbers for President Obama, Senator Dick Durbin, Senator Mark Kirk, and Representative Rodney Davis. 13 years of nonstop U.S. war-making is more than enough. And of course, it didn't begin with 9/11. But the administration that promised hope and change in the war and the economy has dashed hopes and produced no change, except to expand the war. The Obama administration are today committing murder around the world, but pretending that they aren't, in order to mislead the only enemy they really fear, the American people, who drove 2 presidents from office during the Vietnam War. And the government is helped in this deception by a compliant, big business-run media, so Americans know far less about what's going on than citizens of other countries. Tonight we'll try to give a better account with commentaries by Ron Zoke, Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, and I'll be back with a comment about resistance to these wars and where it might come from. And we'll begin tonight with Ron Zoke, cautiously pessimistic.
Yes,
right,
well, we always hear from our public officials that they're cautiously optimistic, and more and more I am not inclined to join into that. In view, for example, of the current craziness about Ukraine and Iran and the oncoming wars against them, in addition to the many that have been mentioned before. When the truth comes out about what happened in Ukraine, I think, a few years from now, there may be a lot of embarrassment and crow devoured in various places. But can we wait for that? No, I think we ought to be resisting that all along. In Iran, the herd has demanded that Iran have no path whatever to an atomic weapon for the next umpteen years or whatever, something that no seems to be nation could really assent to. And just we have to keep asking, why don't you impose the same conditions on Israel? And that will be dismissed immediately with a snort and a laugh and be told that you're crazy, that that's a non-starter, and so on. So think it over, people. Why this hostility toward Iran, which has a perfect right to develop its own defensive weapons, as everyone always insists that they are, and without being controlled by some outside force, some countries such as the USA or even the United Nations. So we see examples of the American system of mind control. A few years ago, there was a popular book called The Soviet System of Mind Control, and you can look at that for some suggestions about what's going on in this country. As usual, I'm looking for sophisms and these bits of sophistry that turn up constantly in our political discourse, and I'm still trying to catalog them. I've never found a really good system of classification for them, but the essential points is that they are completely or mostly fallacious from the standpoint of supporting inferences about political matters. The most common ones recently that I've noticed are in the realm of what we might call sub-sophisms. Watch for these. What may happen or might happen or could happen. These speculations appear endlessly in our supposed news stories about what's going on in the world. And so anytime you read another notice about what could happen or may happen or might happen or could have happened, take note of that. You're being bamboozled, I would say, about some other political matter. This morning there was posted a notice in Nick Verbala's column about the illusion of choice. Someone has figured out that there are 1,500 newspapers in this country, 1,100 magazines, 9,000 radio stations, 1,500 TV stations, 2,400 publishers, all owned by 6 corporations and 272 executives that control 90% of what 277 million Americans see, hear, and read. So it's very difficult for the ordinary person to break out of that. They can't really devote full time to trying to figure out what's going on the basis of the conflicting stories that they will get from these sources and from others that they might try to read that may correct them. So again, I'm cautiously pessimistic about what's going to happen there. I might just mention in passing some other resources if you want to find out what's going on. A good one to start with, a book that came out 12 or 15 years ago actually, Michael Clare's Resource Wars, which is an extended treatment of the competition, international competition that's going on and will increase concerning petroleum resources, water, minerals, timber, agricultural land, and so on. The conflicts over these, who has them, who will get them, who will control them, appears to be becoming ever more intense. A couple of associated books. I'm in the position of the professor who hands out reading lists, which everyone then ignores, of course. David Korten's book on When Corporations Rule the World, which is still very relevant and kind of chilling in view of what's going on with respect to let's say, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Finally, mentioned Daniel Yergin's many books about the international petroleum industry, The Prize, The Quest, The Commanding Heights, and Shattered Peace, and so on. Yergin tries to stay very responsible, and it's not likely to say anything that is very challenging to the power elite in this country. But there's got a lot of interesting information there, and for that I'll stop right now.
Thank you, Ron. You're watching Aware on the Air. We'll pivot to Asia with Karen Aram.
Okay, first thing I just want to mention for my friends in Thailand is that the Thai government has now issued an extradition request for 30 Thai nationals living in foreign countries or having fled to foreign nations. Only a few are in Western nations, and I know that at one point, I think about a year ago, the UK turned them down, said no, because it's over these people having said something, what we call lese majeste, which means against royalty. So you cannot speak out against the monarchy, against the military junta, against any of the power elite. So this is the latest in Thailand. I want to also mention now on Sri Lanka, I've talked about them frequently. Last week I mentioned that I was a little bit astounded that here they were, given after their recent election, and what we call the U.S. Candidate is now in power, and they're paying their respects to India and saying that yes, we're going to back away from so much dealing with China now, which was the whole point, the U.S. wanting to alienate or isolate China, and they put to rest or put on hold a project that China was financing. And this project, it's the building of a port with all that entails. This puts China in the red by about $320,000 US per day, as well as at least 1,000 workers out of work. Yet at the same time, you have the Sri Lankan, either the Prime Minister or the Finance Minister will then be visiting China the end of May, hoping for loans, hoping for money. And I thought, well, that's strange. It didn't make a lot of sense to me. Well, I found out why. That's because they had recently, the Finance Minister of Sri Lanka had recently been in Washington, D.C., where he told the media that there was a lot of international goodwill, and we can get finance from the IMF and World Bank at 0.5% interest rate, et cetera, because they have a lot of debt. Now, a lot of that debt, they have a U.S. $4 billion loan in order to restructure their debt repayments on the high-interest Chinese loans, which were negotiated by the former government. But they also were asking for a $4 billion loan to defer their IMF loan repayment installments from previous loans. Well, what happened was the IMF bluntly rejected their loan request, telling them that they will, they were comfortable and that they really didn't need it. Now, what this is going to mean is that there will be further austerity measures for Sri Lankan workers, the poor, et cetera, and the fact that now they're turning to China makes me wonder where we're really headed. And I wonder if we're going to be looking at another Greek situation. Not exactly the same, but could be a similar situation. Now I want to mention the Asian Investment Bank that we have talked about in the past. No, it's AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And the fact that we talked about it last week, that it was kind of a blow to the U.S. when just a week ago, the British government, Prime Minister David Cameron, announced that it would become what they call a founding member of the bank. And this was a bit of a shock to us. But I want to mention that as U.S. opposition proved to be no deterrent, Germany, France, and Italy followed the British decision with announcements that they were also seeking to become founding members of the bank. I don't understand this founding member title. They're not the founders, but at any rate, they want to be involved with it.
They have a lot of money in it. I think.
Yeah. So other countries in the Asia-Pacific region, including Australia and South Korea, which refused to sign up after intense U.S. opposition last year, are also actively reconsidering their position. Now, last October, the Australian government reversed a previous decision to back the bank following an intervention by U.S. President Barack Obama, Secretary of State John Kerry, and Treasury Secretary Jack Lew. So Australia is reportedly now on the verge of announcing its participation. Make no mistake, this has the U.S. in quite a quandary, okay? Because the motivation for U.S. opposition is that the China-backed AIIB will weaken U.S. economic dominance of the Asia-Pacific region and undermine its drive to ensure continued military supremacy within the framework of the pivot to Asia. But see, the European powers see this as commercial. They see this as in their best interest commercially, while the U.S. sees China always strategically as a maritime power in the Pacific. So this is something that we're looking at happening. And now I want to turn to the Philippines. As of January 25th, evidently commandos belonging to the Special Action Force of the Philippine National Police, they crept into the southern town of Mamasapano. It's a stronghold of the separatist Moro Islamic Liberation Front. Now, the elite seaborne unit had come in there for Zulkifli here, I apologize for mispronunciation. He is a Malaysian bomb maker, better known as Marwan. Okay. By the end of the morning, dozens were dead. Actually, the total count of people killed, I think, are something like 66. Now, this episode has severely discredited the administration of Philippine President Benigno Aquino III. It has jeopardized decades of progress and peace talks with the Moro separatists and underlined the perils for developing world governments that put themselves at the beck and call of Washington. And why this is so important is because the commandos were able to kill Marwan, okay, who'd sat high on the FBI's list of most wanted terrorists. But then all hell broke out. It was a fiasco. It's the kind of thing that they make films out of what actually happened. But the biggest casualty was the Bangsa Moro Basic Law that was in the last stages of being shepherded through the Philippine Congress, known as the BBL. The bill was the product of nearly 5 years of intensive negotiations between the government and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front to put an end to almost 50 years of fighting in the southern Philippines. It would have created an autonomous region for the Muslim Moros, a fiercely independent people that have long resisted integration into the broader Philippine polity. Now, the officials who conceived and implemented the operation to nab Marwan chose not to inform the top people in the police and military leadership. They also ignored and subverted the carefully negotiated procedures for territorial access worked out among the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, the government, and third-party monitors. Now, why is this so important to us? Okay, now I'm getting to that. All right. The big puzzle for many was why a government that was in the last stages of negotiating an autonomy agreement to end 50 years of warfare would endanger this goal. It's said to be a major legacy priority for President Aquino, with a large-scale commando intrusion into Moro territory without informing its negotiating partner. So to an increasing number of people, the answer must have something to do with Washington. Mm-hmm. Indeed, Washington's fingerprints were all over the operation. Mm-hmm. There was a $5 million bounty placed by the Americans on Marwan's head. A U.S. military helicopter appeared in the area after the long firefight, allegedly to help evacuate the wounded. And Marwan's finger disappeared after the battle, and showed up at an FBI lab in the United States a few days later because they weren't able to get his body. Now, the Philippine Daily Inquirer found that U.S. drones had pinpointed Marwan's hiding place, guided the commandos to it, and provided the capability for real-time management by the Philippine commandos away from the battlefield. American advisors, the paper claimed, were the ones who had vetoed informing top officials of the police, the armed forces, and the Liberation Front of the planned raid on the grounds that news of the action would be leaked to Marwan. The original plan was to have a fused team of Seaborne Unit commandos and the Quick Reaction Force, but that was reportedly rejected by the American advisors, who favored having the Seaborne Unit carry out the raid itself and the Quick Reaction Force provide cover, a plan that proved disastrous. The Seaborne Unit it emerged had been trained by retired Navy SEALs and functioned as the American special unit within the Special Forces of the Philippine National Police. Taking out Marwan was a major priority for Washington, not Manila. And as one congressman put it, the Mama Soprano tragedy, that's the name of the village, was a case of the Americans fighting to the last Filipino.
Yep.
The United States to use Philippine bases to implement President Obama's so-called pivot to Asia strategy to contain China. That's why President Aquino had already come under a lot of what we call intense fire from nationalist quarters regarding our military bases there.
Only metaphorical so far.
Right,
fire,
right. Now, 3 years ago, I believe it was 3 years ago, evidently U.S. drones destroyed a village in the south, trying to get a hold of some of these terrorists. But of course, what they did was they killed a lot of innocent villagers. So now what we have is Aquino is he's likely going to be resigning. And what I really think, what to me is most telling about this is how are our other allies going to view this? I mean, this is so telling. And there's a personal postscript to this. Walden Bellow wrote this article. By the way, so did Sarah Lazar. She has an article in Common Dreams which backs up everything Walden Bellow has said here. The Economist they just glaze over it, never mentioning the U.S. involvement. All they talk about is Aquino being responsible and likely to resign, or being forced to resign, excuse me. According to Walden Bellow, he said, there's a personal postscript to this. As a sitting member of the Philippine House of Representatives, I withdrew my political support for President Aquino when he refused to accept command responsibility for the operation. Since my party, Akbayan, remains allied to the administration, I resigned as the congressional representative of the party as well. So, you know, this is going to have, I think, far-reaching consequences. Our military bases being there, you have uprisings from a lot of the nationalists there, and the drone strike by the U.S. back about 3 years ago. We know that happened. We don't hear about any of that, but I think this is something we're going to hear about.
Thank you, Karen. That's very important. Not one American in 100 knows that part of Obama's worldwide terrorist campaign includes killing people in the Philippines.
Right.
And it's remarkable, but unfortunately, it's the way in which the news is managed in this country. News is managed not so much by suppression, but by inattention. This is important. This is, as you said at the beginning, let's talk about this plane crash, not about the people that are being killed in the Philippines by the government that we're responsible for. You're watching Aware on the Air, and we are trying to talk about things that are not being talked about in various ways in the American political world. And we'll go now to Stuart Levy.
Okay. Let's see. Maybe I'll talk about this. So Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut has posted to Move On an invitation to Move On members, or really whoever wants to write about it, to comment on U.S. foreign policy. And the framing may not be the best we could hope for, but it's an interesting invitation. So I wanted to read some of this. He's writing in the context of the 12th anniversary of the onset of the U.S. war in Iraq. Americans are tired of endless war and frustrated with a Congress that refuses to debate and vote on questions of war and peace. Good for him. Our nation needs to rethink its foreign policy. That sounds good. And then he goes on to consider leaning into the world with something other than the pointed edge of a sword. Let's see. Too much of the debate about America's role in the world offers two flawed choices: knee-jerk military interventionism or xenophobic isolationism. With all respect to my colleagues, if those are our only choices, hundreds of millions of people around the world and the United States' interests will be worse off. Let's see. In a May 2014 West Point commencement address, President Obama recognized the limits of military power, prioritizing the use of our military for counterterrorism efforts and emphasizing the need to strengthen the rule of law and human rights in developing nations, like the Philippines maybe. Yet I believe a progressive foreign policy should differ from President Obama's approach on some substantial questions such as domestic surveillance, drone attacks, and most recently military intervention in Syria. And then it will be hard to read this bit with a straight face. You might think of there being three corners of American foreign policy: McCain, Paul, and Obama. But none of these represents a truly progressive vision of what is possible. So today we need to square the triangle. And I need your help to make that happen. All right, so, but he does go on and suggest some things that he thinks would be interesting points to make in a better designed foreign policy. And I think this is, whether we like these or not, and we probably don't, I think this is a good framework, and I think it would be a good thing to leap on. So he suggests a substantial reinvestment in the tools of diplomacy and economic development through increased funding for foreign assistance programs. Okay. A new humility to our foreign policy with less emphasis on short-term influencers such as unilateral military intervention, and more effort spent working with regional partners and allies toward local political solutions. An end to unchecked mass surveillance programs at home and abroad as part of a new recognition that we are safer as a nation when we are not so easily labeled as hypocrites for preaching and practicing vastly differently on human and civil rights. And a categorical rejection of torture under any circumstances. So those are his starting points, and he is asking for further suggestions. Let's see. Maybe I'll stop with that.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Stuart. There's an important point there, including the indication of what really is going on in American politics at the top level. That's a peculiar triangle to meditate on, a three-way division between Obama, McCain, and Paul. That gives us pause, I think, for a number of reasons. We might come back to that. You're watching Aware on the Air. We will turn to Karen Evans-Levy.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot prepared. I just wanted to talk about a couple conversations that I've had with people over the last couple of weeks that kind of center around the mayoral campaign in Champaign. In particular, the debates have, several questions have been asked about why is the Champaign government ignoring the poor or destroying low-income housing and gentrification and things like that. And they always fail to answer the question why they're doing it and why there is no low-income housing in Champaign, or a reduced number of housing. And also conversations about criminalization of the poor in particular, and like laws about loitering and things like that. And I just wanted to bring those up as issues that we should be asking our representatives and the people who actually make decisions in our local communities to talk about those things, and to also ask ourselves, are we being led astray every time that we think that, oh yeah, it's a poor neighborhood, I shouldn't walk in it because the crime rate is really high, and we don't have any facts to back that up? Or why is there a poor neighborhood, and how can we, instead of demolishing it and building huge businesses and things like that, how can we actually have our city embrace the poor and actually help them out instead of moving them out to the fringe? And so I just want to leave it at that kind of question for everybody to discuss or argue against or whatever. So.
Thank you, Karen. We'll go back around now on the panel with some comments about the things that have been said so far. I wanted to start with a comment of Ron's. Ron led off today with the fantasy that the truth will come out about what happened and what's happening in Ukraine a few years from now, and what will we see then? And it seems to me that's a very good way to think about it, because we have not an exact parallel by any means, but certainly a parallel that's worth thinking about. 16 years ago today, the U.S. attacked Yugoslavia. The Clinton administration began bombing Serbia, and it's taken almost that long for the truth to come out about what Clinton was up to. For my sins, I have just reread Clinton's speech that he gave in 1999 as the U.S. began attacking Serbia. Of course, in violation of the United Nations Charter. The U.S. had no right to attack Serbia, and the explanation at the time was that we were preventing genocide, that the Serbs were killing people in Kosovo, and that had to be stopped, and the way to stop it was to send bombers from America to bomb Yugoslavia. It wasn't clear to many Americans at all then why the U.S. was attacking Serbia, just as it's not clear at all to many Americans why the U.S. is promoting a proxy war in Ukraine today. And it did take a while for it to come out what in fact the U.S. was doing in Serbia. It came finally, years later, from the highest level of the Clinton administration that confirmed some of the things that were being suggested over against the flat-out lies we were getting from the American president about why we were killing people in Europe. The eventual truth came from a very disturbing figure called Strobe Talbott, who is now head of the Brookings Institution and a part of the American planning establishment in Washington. Strobe Talbott was in charge of the Pentagon State Department Intelligence Joint Committee on Diplomacy, that's what they called it, during the attack on Serbia. And so he was at the very top of the Clinton administration. He wrote the foreword to a book by his director of communications years later. The director of communications is a man called John Norris. And in the foreword, Strobe Talbott says, if you really want to understand what the thinking was at the top of the Clinton administration, this is the book you should read, that is Norris's book, and take a look at what Norris says was the real purpose of the war. It had nothing to do with the concern for Kosovar Albanians, the people in Kosovo that we were supposedly preventing from being the victims of genocide. It was because Serbia was not carrying out the required social and economic reforms, meaning it was the last corner of Europe which had not subordinated itself to the U.S.-run neoliberal programs, so therefore it had to be eliminated. And this was, as I say, the testimony from the top of the Clinton administration. It really had nothing to do, as a number of people pointed out at the time, with protecting people in Kosovo. The serious attacks on people in Kosovo began only after the U.S. bombing of Serbia occurred. I mean, it was a made-up excuse. It wasn't because of the Kosovo Albanians, the people in Kosovo. But all the discussion at the time was, oh, what are we going to do? Of course, Clinton had to bypass the United Nations. He had to bomb Serbia because Serbia was attacking people in Kosovo. It was a lie, straight-out lie, and it took years for the admission of that lie ever to become clear. The parallel with Ukraine, I think, that Ron drew, I think is very important. What actually happened in Ukraine is perhaps better known now than what happened in Serbia was in the Clinton administration, but in each case, it's the U.S. following policies that benefit the American 1%, the American rich, and keeps the Europeans in line with that program. But that's not the way it's talked about in this country. What we hear is the fact, oh, we have to stand up against Russian aggression. So in many ways, the Ukrainian situation is in some sense far worse than what happened in Serbia, because if only because the death toll is already higher and threatens to become much higher indeed.
On that,
comments? Yeah.
on that, every time that we do intervene and on behalf of someone, we should also be asking, okay, why are we choosing this one and not this very similar situation over on this other side? Like, why didn't we protect Tibet then? And we can't do, okay, so that's one question. Why are we choosing this one versus that one? And then the second one is, how is the military actually going to be able to, to accomplish any of the goals that we want, except for that we want someone in place that will do what our bidding. And so those are two really important questions I think that we need to ask anytime an intervention is suggested. It is why this one, and military, really?
Mm-hmm.
So,
I can answer why we never protected Tibet, because it would have been against China. And in fact, what we did do, and this is what most Americans aren't aware of, we supported the Dalai Lama to, I think, the tune of like $156,000 a month or something like that. Or maybe it was a year, I forgot now. But we supported him and a lot of his, we'll call them soldiers. And what finally resulted, this was throughout the 50s and 60s, certainly throughout the 60s, throughout the 70s, or maybe it was the early 70s, that, or mid-70s, I don't have my information here, but Kissinger finally asked the question, when Zhou Enlai, so it was before Zhou Enlai died, when Zhou Enlai let Kissinger know that we know what you're doing, because all of that just resulted in a lot of dead Chinese, and plus a lot of dead Tibetans, and bloody satchels that had information of no value. So Kissinger then went back to his people, the CIA, and asked them what the results of this funding were, and they had to admit that there were no good results, and so they ended it. But that's the way we support war, and that comes into with what we were doing in the Philippines, and why I think what's so important that's been unveiled here is that we may not send our soldiers in, but we certainly have our so-called advisors all over the world, including the Philippines. We have our bases, and we have proxies. In fact, a lot of the information that came out of this was in secret, because most of the high-level Filipino, whether it was the police, because this was conducted by police and military combined, they would not talk about it. They would not reveal any information unless it was in an executive session meeting, meaning secret, because they were told by the U.S. that, this is to be kept quiet. We're not supposed to be involved in this. So the use of proxies is the way we operate today, which is what we're doing in the Ukraine. So some people know about it and some people don't.
Well, these places keep getting exposed that are not submitting to American leadership,
Right.
apparently, and we
Leadership,
have to do
yes.
Right.
something about that. About the Moros, I don't know much of anything about them. They are a minority group, an ethnic group within
Right.
the Philippines.
Right. Well, you have to realize that the north is Christian and the south is primarily Islamic. Islam settled in the Philippines a couple centuries ago, I think in the 12th century or something. And then you had the Christians, but that came about through the Spanish conquerors and
You remember
colonialists.
when President McKinley, in the McKinley administration, when the U.S. took the Philippines
Mm-hmm.
as part of its China policy, of its attempt to open China, that is, to dominate China economically, when the McKinley administration seized the Philippines as part of the Spanish-American War, President McKinley said the reason we were doing it was to Christianize them.
Right, right.
Now, no one had told, it's always been a question of whether no one had told him that the Philippines were Catholic, or whether he assumed Catholic was not Christian,
I don't
and
know,
therefore
yeah.
he had to make
Right,
American
right.
Protestants out of them
Right.
rather than Catholic.
But
It's
they-
not clear.
but
But
they-
the explanation
Yes.
was, the reason we see
Right.
Philippines don't talk to me about
Right.
China's economy, we were to Christianize them.
But something that they don't recognize is that the South is Islamic. And it
Exactly.
still is today. And they have been fighting for their independence for some time now. And of course, we then labeled them terrorists.
Exactly.
There was a group of, they were terrorists, called Abu Sayyaf, and that took place in the, I think in the late 90s, and even when I was in the Philippines in the early 2000s, where they did kidnap some missionaries and held them for ransom, etc. And there were accusations that they were affiliated with bin Laden, which, from what I understand, they were not. But but these are not the same. These are not the same terrorists. I'm not saying that they are all nice, good guys. Marwan is a bomb maker, and he's Malaysian. But you have the Malaysian separatists who've been fighting for their independence and for their property in the south of Thailand as well. But it's the U.S. involvement that is really the most frightening aspect of the whole thing.
How
And
different is this group? Ethnically, culturally, linguistically? Do they speak Tagalog or
there are so many
Arabic?
The interesting thing is that
Good question.
I think some do. In fact, my last name, Aram, I met one person who actually said his first name was Aram, and of course it turned out he was from the south because it's of Islamic, where through the north, most of the people have Christian names. But Tagalog isn't the only language spoken there. It's one of the most popular, but there are many, many languages spoken in the Philippines, and many, many dialects, evidently. So, and how do we as foreigners really know when we're meeting and talking with people? But most of the people from the Philippines that come here, I mean, basically they are an indigenous people. And again, if you look at a map, you'll see that Mindanao and the southern portion of the Philippines is closer to Malaysia and Indonesia, and they were all settled Islamic. And it was the West, primarily the Spanish, that colonized the northern portion. And then, of course, Marcos was our boy, and I don't know the relationship that we have with this current President Aquino. I know that he's clearly a son or something of Cory Aquino, who was the former president, and it was her husband who was assassinated by one of their poor presidents previously. But
The indispensable Wikipedia tells us that the Moro people, or Bangsamoro, are a population of indigenous Muslims in the Philippines, forming the largest non-Catholic group in the country and comprising about 5% of the total Philippine population.
Yeah.
They speak a variety of languages, including Arabic and English, but also a number of local Philippine languages, as well as Malaysian and others. So it's quite a mixed group, but
Right.
the identity of the group obviously depends upon the fact that, as Karen said, they're Muslims. And that's been the political basis of the Moro rebellion in the Philippines, and the reason they've attracted the attention of American, of Obama's drones. Why Obama is trying to kill them with drones is that they are part of the worldwide terrorist conspiracy that justifies the U.S. imperialism.
Isn't part of the problem that there are hundreds, maybe thousands of islands there, and they
Yeah.
can maintain a certain amount of distinction on that basis?
right. I mean, this is a picture of them taken in 2008, and you can see they're in a boat. They're wearing military uniforms. I mean, yeah. So,
So I had a few comments and questions. In talking about Ukraine, Ron, you were saying you looked forward to hearing crow devoured. And I'm just wondering, I mean, do we hear much of that with respect to the invasion of Iraq?
No.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
it's an aspirational crow, I guess.
Right, yeah, I admit that readily.
With
Crow
respect to,
when the crow of peace arrives, we'll eat it, right?
Crow.
with respect to Sri Lankan austerity and looking for loans from elsewhere, it seems like a natural thing for the Chinese to do would be to try to undermine the IMF. I mean, they're not short of money. why don't they offer loans to many countries on better terms than
Well,
the
that's-
IMF?
That's what I think they're planning on doing.
I think
That's
that's
why
right.
the
So
Sri
undercutting
Lankan,
their own, because you said they were, what the Sri Lankans were trying to do was to pay back the high interest that they had on existing loans to China.
plus other loans that they have to the IMF. But now they are, because they were turned down by the IMF,
By the
they
IMF,
are
okay.
going to China.
Uh-huh.
And now that China has set up their own development bank, which will compete with both the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, which is a sister of the World Bank. And
Is this, I'm sorry, is this the same bank that's recently been talked about that would be multi-currency, like the UK was interested in
Yes.
participating? That's the
Well,
same,
the
same
UK,
bank?
yes,
Okay.
yes, AIIB, it's called, the Asian Infrastructure, what is it called? The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, yeah. Yeah.
All right.
This is important. I mean, American neoliberalism, one of the fundamental aspects of American neoliberalism, and by that I mean the sort of attempt for 40 years now of American business to roll back social supports in the U.S. and around the world. One of the goals of American neoliberalism is to make sure that the global economy is organized in a way that profits the American 1%. That means cheap labor abroad. Globalization is primarily a matter of investment abroad so that you don't have to pay American workers, you don't have to pay expensive workers anyplace, you can pay only cheap workers around the world. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, has been a major element in this process of globalization, of impoverishment of the workers of the world under globalization. And the Chinese are coming along and saying, look, we'll lend you money for development on better terms than the IMF, and ways that will not depend upon exploiting the underpaid workers around the world, but ways that in fact will support their lifestyle. It's a conscious policy offered in opposition to the IMF, and at the same time the Chinese say, look, we simply want to participate in the worldwide economic procedures that the IMF was originally set up during the Second World War to support.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they've got them coming, they got the Americans coming and going on this point.
Let's hope.
Yes.
I mean, Pepe Escobar has talked a lot about this in conjunction with what he calls the Middle East oil and the nuclear puzzle. And I have the article right here, but it's really, I found it difficult to absorb all of the details and information related to finance and what he calls Pipelinistan and the way he writes.
Pepe's
Pepe.
name for the
Yeah,
Middle East,
yeah.
why the Middle East is so
Right.
important to the
But-
U.S.
But it combines all of
the
what
stands.
we've been talking about on the program related to China with their Silk Road, with their railroads that they're building all across Europe and Asia, as well as what he calls the Pipelinistan, meaning the oil pipelines that are going clear across.
All the countries that have Stan in their name.
Right. Plus Russia. And now you have Russia and China working in conjunction on all of this. So, and as far as currency change, that's something Pepe has been talking about also, is that it's quite likely Russia and China are going to be buying and paying for their oil in either probably yuan, I would imagine. Chinese yuan, more than likely, or as we call it, RMB.
You're watching We're on the Air. We're commenting on some of the things that have been said about the worldwide economic and military operations of the United States, where as the anti-war, anti-racism effort is trying to offer some reflections on these issues which are usually so wretchedly treated, if at all, in the American media. Other comments?
What I actually
Prince?
had in mind was something like the truth that emerged eventually concerning the CIA coup in Iran in the early 1950s.
Uh-huh.
And we have a general acknowledgement of that pretty much, but how long, will it take another 50 years
Yep.
for what happened in Ukraine to become.
Will we be around?
Actually, well,
Will
I
we
think
be, well, I'm not talking about we sitting here, I'm just saying,
I am.
given the provocation by NATO against Russia, who has nuclear weapons, and how serious this provocation
Yeah,
is to
yeah.
Russia's sovereignty, and everything that is happening, 50 years from now, the information really won't mean anything, even if it's available.
I think I think one of the points that Ron's question raises is the continuity and consistency of American policy
Yeah.
from the coups in the 1950s
Right.
through the war in Serbia the attack on Serbia in 1990 down to Ukraine. It was said of the Bourbons that they had learned nothing and forgotten nothing after Napoleon. Well, it seems to me in many ways the American foreign policy after the Cold War has learned nothing and forgotten nothing. It continues to do the same things, even though we say, oh, new start, old Bush foreign policy is gone, new Obama foreign policy is in.
Right.
And it turns out to be the same thing.
Exactly.
And this is the beginning of wisdom is to pay attention to the history that Ron's talking about, to see that in fact once you get an accurate story of what happened, there's a remarkable continuity in that story down to the people that Obama killed in the Philippines this week.
Well, this was why 2 weeks ago I was talking about history and how important history is. And of course, you provoked me a little bit as to whose history and what history, but basically knowing what happened in Iran, knowing what happened in Chile, and looking at it and saying, you know what, see the same thing unfolding now in the Ukraine. So
we eventually had an acknowledgement about the origins of the Iraq War too from who was it? Anyway, was it about oil initially? Oh no, it's about freedom, democracy, and human rights.
Yeah.
Eventually.
Oh, you're thinking of Greenspan. It was talking Alan Greenspan. It talked about,
Of course, it was about oil.
That raises yes, and this from hardly a liberal or advanced member of the American government structure. I mean, Alan Greenspan, the Ayn Rand enthusiast who ran the Fed. But actually, that raises a point. You mentioned Michael Clare's book, Ron, on resource wars, and Clare is an interesting fellow. He's been writing about this stuff for a while. My quibble with him, maybe more than a quibble, is that the recognition that the Iraq War was a resource war, was about oil, sometimes I think mistakes it by saying the U.S. needs access to oil. We've heard a good number of American politicians saying, well, we want to wean America away from Middle East oil. And so that was always nonsense. It's been nonsense since the Second World War, since the U.S. basically took control of world energy resources. The U.S. has never had a shortage of oil. The U.S. in fact gets most of the oil that we use from the Western Hemisphere, not from the Middle East at all, and never has. Until a few years ago, the U.S. was domestically self-sufficient in oil, and fracking looks like making the U.S. domestically self-sufficient in oil once again if we want to be. The question was never access to oil for the United States government. The question was control of world oil supplies, because, as people like Zbigniew Brzezinski said, to control world oil supplies is to control those countries that are economic rivals of the United States. China needs oil. Japan imports 100% of its energy resources. Germany imports 80% of its energy resources. Control of world oil is the essential economic stranglehold that the U.S. has insisted upon since the Second World War. That's the reason we killed 1 million Iraqis.
I think a good deal of the point may still remain if you switch the discussion to natural gas.
Oh, indeed, yes, that's true. In fact, even more so, the Pipelinistan that Pepe was referring to, that Karen mentioned a moment ago, usually are gas pipelines, including the recent decision by the Russians to say, okay, we'll send a gas pipeline through Turkey rather than under Black Sea, as we were.
And we're building these enormous ports for liquefied natural gas on the East Coast and so on, and that may be the next big point of conflict.
And when we begin to look at what the U.S. is doing, in each case there needs to be this sort of rectification of names, to be Confucian about it, about what the U.S. is actually doing. Is the U.S. Defending Middle Eastern countries against terrorism? No, the U.S. is continuing its longstanding policy of controlling world energy resources. But you can't have an honest discussion about what the U.S. is doing when you have a dishonest account of what the U.S. is doing as a starting point.
And back to the Philippines, we just destroyed a peace negotiation that had been in the process for many, many years. We just destroyed it totally. So it created conflict.
And the conflicts over water are going to become more and more intense,
Yep.
including domestically in Southern California. We're heading for a big crisis there apparently this
Right,
summer.
right. 1 year left of water in California.
And it's, once again, it's worldwide too. It's Sao Paulo, is it, that
Yep.
that is down to its last, I mean, they're literally trucking in water to a huge city in Brazil. That you have been watching Aware on the Air. We have concluding comments, ladies and gentlemen. Anybody?
The Green Party meetup on the 31st at the Urbana Public Library at 7 in the evening. That's for anyone who's interested in being involved with us.
So that's March 31st, and then in
Yes.
April, they're having the meetup. Go ahead and tell about
Well, that's
that.
state, no, I won't. That's
Okay.
the state. We'll talk about that the next time.
No, but we
just-
should let people know
that's
that
a
it's
good point.
happening.
It's coming up.
Yeah.
Well, it gets confused. I want people to come to the one on the 31st. That's the most important one. And we've talked about the
that's
one
the
in
local
April.
one.
Yeah, on April 18th, that's the,
Aware, the sponsor of this program, has what we might have called in earlier days a fraternal relationship with the Green Party, but I suppose it's
right.
sororal as well, so
Yeah.
there we are. Other upcoming events that should be noted?
Not that we can think of.
There aren't enough local upcoming events on peace. There you go. That's all I have to say about it.
not enough.
You have been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 13th week of 2015. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. And see the Facebook page for Aware for articles that we referred to and comments by us and by people who want to comment on what we're saying. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and the rest, who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Ron Zoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, Karen Aram, Michael Bay, David Johnson, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.